640 buildings. That is what a single grass fire took out of the second largest city in Washington state between noon on Saturday and sunrise on Sunday. And as I record this, it is still burning at 0% containment. It started in an open field about 10 miles from downtown Spokane. It doubled in size in 20 minutes. It crossed a river. And here is the part I cannot get past. Everybody saw it coming. The National Weather Service reached for a warning level it had never used in the entire history of the state. The governor declared an emergency before the fire existed. The National Guard was already moving. The fire department had already staffed up, and none of it made any difference at all. So if the warning was perfect, then what exactly failed? Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Let's get into it. Part 1. Noon. A fire started in dry grass at lunchtime on a Saturday, and by the time the sun came up the next morning it had destroyed 640 buildings inside and around the second largest city in Washington state. That is the whole event in one sentence, and almost every word of it should be impossible. Grass fires are not supposed to reach cities. Cities are not supposed to lose entire neighborhoods to something that started in a field. And the fire that did this was not burning through some remote stretch of timber where nobody could get to it. It started roughly 10 miles from downtown Spokane, in open country west of town, in full daylight, on a day when the fire agencies of an entire state were staffed up, mobilized, and staring directly at it. They saw it coming. That is the part that matters. 24 hours before the first flame existed, the National Weather Service reached for a warning level it had never used in the history of Washington state. The governor declared a statewide emergency before a single one of these fires had started. The National Guard was already moving. The local fire department had nearly doubled the number of people on shift. The power company had already warned that it might cut electricity to the whole region on purpose, because it was afraid of what its own equipment might do in the wind. And then the fire started anyway, and none of it mattered. Here is where the numbers stand as I record this, and I want to be honest with you up front that every one of them is moving. The 3 fires burning around Spokane have been merged into a single incident called the Spokane Complex. Combined, they have burned 7,708 acres. That is roughly 12 square miles. Containment stands at 0%. Not 5, not 2, 0. Every foot of the perimeter of that fire is still capable of moving. 640 structures were confirmed destroyed by the Old Trails fire alone, according to Cody Rohrbach, the fire chief of Spokane County Fire District 3, at a 6 a.m. damage briefing. The Washington State Emergency Operations Center put the total for the Spokane area at approximately 700 structures in a Sunday morning report. Around 5,000 more structures are considered threatened. 60,000 people were evacuated from inside Spokane city limits, and more than 65,000 statewide are under evacuation orders. Roughly 5,000 homes emptied out in a single afternoon. Spokane's mayor, Lisa Brown, stood at a news conference on Sunday and called it, really the worst natural disaster our region has faced. Some officials have gone further and suggested this may end up being the most destructive wildfire event in Washington state history. So that is the payoff, delivered early, because you deserve to know what you're actually looking at before I spend the next stretch of this video explaining how it happened. This is not a fire that is going to be contained by the time you finish watching. This is not a story about a close call. This is a story about a city that lost a piece of itself in about 8 hours in front of everyone with maximum warning. Now let me take you back to noon. The ignition point was near the intersection of Old Trails Road and West Euclid Road, north of the town of Airway Heights, on a stretch of ground that people in the area call the West Plains. It is open country, grass and brush, the kind of terrain that looks like nothing, that you drive past without registering, that has no drama in it at all until the day it does. The first size estimate was around 50 acres. 20 minutes later it was around 100 acres. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because the doubling is the whole story of what happened next. A fire that doubles in 20 minutes is not creeping. It is not smouldering in duff waiting for someone to notice it. It is running. And the reason it was running is that 3 separate conditions had lined up on that specific afternoon in a way that fire behavior specialists spend their careers hoping not to see all at once. The first was wind. Sustained winds out of the southwest at 20 to 30 miles an hour, with gusts measured at 35 to 45 and a forecast that had them peaking around 8 in the evening. The second was humidity. Relative humidity in the single digits. Not low, single digits. The third was the fuel itself, and that one takes longer to explain, so I will come back to it, because it is the reason the other two mattered as much as they did. State firefighting resources were mobilized by 1:30 in the afternoon. That is fast. That is a system working. And it made no difference to the outcome, because by the time those resources were rolling, the fire was already doing something that no amount of engines can stop. And this fire did not stay alone for long. Shortly before 4 in the afternoon, a second fire ignited on the other side of the county, in an area called Peon Prairie. It was named the Fairview Fire. Later that afternoon, a third fire broke out northwest of the original ignition point, and that one was named the Autumn Lane Fire. 3 separate major fires, in one county, on one afternoon, in a region whose firefighting resources were already stretched across 10 other large fires burning elsewhere in the state. I will come back to each of those, because the way they behaved individually matters. But the reason I'm naming them now is that within about 24 hours, a federal incident management team would stop treating them as 3 fires and start managing them as one. The official designation became the Spokane Complex. If you have heard that name in coverage of this event, that is what it refers to. It is not a single fire with a single origin. It is an administrative decision to stop pretending that 3 fires burning in the same county, drawing on the same resources driven by the same wind, on the same afternoon were separate problems. The cause of the Old Trails fire, the one that started it all, is still officially under investigation. Nobody has said what lit it. I will come back to that too, because in a season where the 5 largest fires in the state were all started by lightning, the fact that this one has not been attributed to lightning is a detail worth sitting with. By just before 3:30 in the afternoon, Level 3 evacuation orders were being issued inside the city limits of Spokane. I want to explain that terminology, because it gets thrown around in coverage of these events and it can sound bureaucratic when it is anything but. Washington uses a 3-level evacuation system. Level 1 means get ready. Level 2 means get set, be prepared to leave at a moment's notice. Level 3 means go now. And the way the agencies write it out in the actual alerts is not softened at all. Leave immediately. This may be your only notice. That phrasing exists because of a specific and grim piece of learned experience. In a wind-driven fire, the window between you can still drive out of here and you cannot is not measured in hours. It is sometimes measured in minutes. Once a fire encircles a road, the people on the wrong side of it are not evacuating anymore. They are sheltering, or they are not. Large parts of northwest Spokane hit Level 3 that afternoon. The initial zone was everything north of Francis Avenue and west of Division Street, which is not a rural fringe. That is a substantial fraction of a city of roughly 230,000 people, and at that point, the fire had not yet done the thing that turned this from a serious wildfire into a historic one. It had not yet crossed the river. There is a river between the West Plains and the neighborhoods of northwest Spokane. The Spokane River runs right through it, cutting a gorge through Riverside State Park, and if you have ever stood on the footbridge at the Bowl and Pitcher and looked down at that water, your instinct would tell you the same thing mine would. That is a fire break. That is where it stops. It did not stop. I will tell you exactly how a fire crosses a river, and it is not the way most people picture it. But before I do, I need you to understand why this particular landscape was ready to burn in a way that eastern Washington has almost never been ready to burn, and why the people whose job it is to watch for this had already, 24 hours earlier, reached for a piece of language they had never used before. Part 2. The warning Washington had never issued. On Friday, July 31st, the National Weather Service issued something for eastern Washington that it had never issued for eastern Washington in the entire history of the office. It is called a particularly dangerous situation alert. If you follow severe weather at all, you have probably encountered that phrase attached to tornado watches. It is a tag the Weather Service adds when the ordinary product does not carry enough weight for what the atmosphere is about to do. It means, this is not the usual version of this thing. Pay a different kind of attention. For fire weather, the standard product is a red flag warning. That is issued when dry fuels and dangerous weather combine to create extreme fire danger, and in eastern Washington in late July, red flag warnings are routine. People who live there have seen dozens of them. They are a normal part of summer. The particularly dangerous situation tag sits above that. It is reserved for the most extreme combinations of fuel and weather the forecasters can identify, and Washington State had never used it. Not once. The alert covered Spokane, the Waterville Plateau, the Okanogan Valley, the Western Columbia Basin, the Colville Reservation, the Palouse and the Snake River areas, which is to say, most of the dry half of the state. Cody Rohrbach, the same fire chief who would later be the one to confirm the 640 destroyed structures, described the coming Saturday as the most significant weather event of the year as it pertains to wildfire. That is a forecast delivered publicly, a day in advance by the person who would end up counting the damage. Russ Lane, the Wildland Fire Division manager for the Washington Department of Natural Resources, was more specific and more blunt. With extremely dry fuels on the landscape, he said, wildfires are already growing rapidly and hard to control. High winds on Saturday will create explosive fire growth that is rarely seen in Washington State. Explosive fire growth that is rarely seen in Washington State. Written down, in advance, by the state's Wildland Fire Division manager. Joey Clevenger, a meteorologist with the National Weather Service, laid out the mechanics. A dry cold front was sweeping across all of Washington and into parts of Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. The winds would pick up in the late morning, build through the day, and peak around 8 in the evening in Spokane. Sustained 20 to 30, gusts to 40 and 50. And then he said the thing that, in hindsight, is the most quietly unnerving line in the entire forecast. He warned that people living in town were not exempt from the risk, that mowing a lawn could throw the spark, that driving with chains dangling onto the pavement could throw the spark. His summary of what would happen if anything did ignite. If there is a new start, it's going to be hard to get any kind of containment on it initially with the winds going. Now watch what happened next, because this is where the story stops being about a fire and starts being about a system. Governor Bob Ferguson declared a statewide wildfire emergency on Saturday morning. He also issued a statewide burn ban, prohibiting most outdoor and agricultural burning through September 30th. And I need you to hold on to the timing here, because it is the single most striking fact in this entire event. He declared that emergency before a single one of the Spokane fires existed. Not in response to them, in anticipation of them, or in anticipation of something exactly like them, somewhere in the state, on that specific day. His statement read, "Our record-setting drought and high winds are creating dangerous conditions across the state. I am declaring an emergency to help prevent loss of life and property damage. I encourage all Washingtonians to do their part to protect our state during these extreme conditions." On Friday, at the request of Commissioner of Public Lands Dave Upthegrove, Ferguson had already mobilized 110 members of the Washington National Guard to fire lines across the state. That was the first Guard activation for wildfire in Washington since 2021. It came on top of 27 Guard helicopter crew members who had already been assigned earlier in July. The Spokane Fire Department staffed up. Assistant Chief Lance Dahl said the department normally runs about 69 firefighters on duty. That Saturday, roughly 100 were working. Spokane Police and the Spokane County Sheriff's Office both increased their staffing as well. Avista Utilities, the regional power company, had warned on Friday that it might preemptively shut off power because of the conditions. That is a utility looking at a forecast and concluding that its own infrastructure is a liability. The Washington Department of Natural Resources went further and told people in the affected areas to expect power outages outright, either because fire would damage the lines or because somebody would shut them off to keep the lines from starting more fire. There is one more piece of context from that Friday that changes how you read all of it, and it is the part that rarely makes the headlines. Washington was not entering that weekend with a fresh, rested firefighting force. As of Friday, 10 large wildland fires were already actively burning in the state, and between them, they had already consumed about 200,000 acres. Roughly 4,000 personnel were already assigned to those fires. More than a dozen other states were already sending help, including crews and engines from Alaska and from Florida, which tells you how far outside the region the state was already reaching. Crews from Australia were working in eastern Washington as well. Dave Upthegrove, the Commissioner of Public Lands, described the position they were in without dressing it up. "We have about 4,000 personnel assigned to those fires," he said. "We have more than a dozen states helping out, like Alaska and Florida. Folks are stretched thin." He said something else that same day that has aged into one of the more haunting quotes of the whole event. This year has already been one of our busiest wildfire years on record, Up the Grove said, and we just started August. His advice to residents was as unambiguous as the evacuation language itself. If you get a notice, leave immediately. These fires move fast. We're expecting high winds. We can see fires moving more than 100 miles an hour, and they can be deadly. So let me lay the sequence out plainly, because the shape of it is what makes this event strange rather than simply sad. The Weather Service identified the danger a full day in advance and escalated to a warning level the state had never used. The governor declared a statewide emergency and a burn ban before ignition. The National Guard was already deployed. The fire department nearly doubled its shift. The power company was preparing to go dark on purpose. Public officials went on camera and used words like explosive and extraordinary and rarely seen. Every element of the early warning chain performed, and then a fire started in Grass at noon, and by dawn 640 buildings were foundations. Which raises a question that I do not think has a comfortable answer, and it is the question this entire video is built around. If the warning was perfect, and the outcome was catastrophic anyway, then what exactly failed? To get anywhere near that, you have to understand what the landscape of eastern Washington had already been through before that Saturday morning, because the fire behavior everyone was bracing for was not really about the wind. The wind was just the trigger. The thing that made it lethal had been building for 4 years. Part 3. 4 years without water. In early April of 2026, Washington state declared a statewide drought emergency. That by itself is not remarkable. States declare droughts. What is remarkable is that it was the 4th consecutive year Washington had done it. 4 years in a row. That is not a drought. That is a condition. And the number underneath that declaration is the one that explains everything that happened on the 1st of August. In early April, when mountain snowpack in the Pacific Northwest typically reaches its annual peak, Washington's snowpack stood at 52% of normal, just over half. In Oregon, the number was 14% of normal, 14%. In the state directly to the south, at the moment in the calendar when there should be more snow in the mountains than at any other point in the year, there was almost none. I want to walk through why that matters, because the connection between a thin snowpack in April and a neighborhood burning in August is not obvious, and it is the actual physical spine of this story. Snowpack is not just water storage, it is a timer. Through the spring, melting snow feeds soil moisture, streams, and the water content of living vegetation across the landscape below. As long as that melt is running, plants stay hydrated, dead material stays damp, and the whole system resists ignition. When the snow runs out, the timer starts. Soil dries. Grasses cure, meaning they finish their growing cycle, die back, and turn from green fuel that resists fire into standing dead fuel that carries it. Dead branches, needles, and duff on the forest floor give up their remaining moisture to the air. In a normal year, that process finishes sometime in midsummer, and the landscape spends a few weeks in a genuinely receptive state before autumn rain shuts it down again. In 2026, with half the normal snowpack in Washington and almost none in Oregon, that clock started running weeks early. The melt ran out early. The curing finished early. And the window in which the landscape would readily burn opened well ahead of schedule and stayed open straight into the part of the calendar when lightning storms and dry frontal passages are most common. Karen Bumbaco, Washington's deputy state climatologist, put the follow-through simply. Since that April drought declaration was made, temperatures across the state stayed above normal and precipitation stayed below normal. The situation did not stabilize. It compounded. Fuel moisture across eastern Washington and the Oregon Cascades tracked below normal all season and at times hit record lows. Fuel moisture is worth understanding in plain terms because it is the number fire behavior analysts actually watch. It expresses how much water is held in vegetation as a percentage of the vegetation's dry weight. Fine dead fuels, grass, small twigs, needles, the stuff that carries fire fastest, exchange moisture with the air quickly, sometimes over the course of a single afternoon. Below roughly 6 to 8%, those fuels will take a flame from almost anything and carry it with almost no energy input. That is the state eastern Washington was in. Not merely dry, record dry, in places, in fuels that respond to conditions within hours. And the 4-year part is what makes it different from a bad summer. A single dry year affects the fine fuels, the grass, the twigs, the surface litter. Those recover with one wet winter. What 4 consecutive drought years do is reach deeper. Larger dead material, the logs and heavy branches that normally hold moisture through the season and act as a brake on fire intensity, exchange water with their surroundings slowly, over weeks and months rather than hours. Give them 1 dry year and they end the summer drier than they started. Give them 4 and they never get back to where they began. Living vegetation runs the same deficit through its roots. By the 4th year, the landscape does not just have dry grass on it. It has dry everything, all the way down, and the fine fuels sitting on top of it are simply the part that catches first. That is why the same wind, on the same date, in a normal year, does not produce the same fire. The trigger was ordinary. The thing it pulled was not. Now put the season on top of that. By the end of July, more than 1,000 fires had already burned in Washington since the start of the year, consuming roughly 425,000 acres. That is over 660 square miles of forest, neighborhoods, tribal land, and scab land. State officials said more land had burned than in any full year since 2021, and that was before August, which is when the Northwest fire season normally peaks and then continues until autumn rain finally arrives. Thomas Kyle Millward, a spokesperson for the Department of Natural Resources, framed it precisely. Seeing large fires on the landscape in the last week in July isn't unusual, he said, but it's the number that we've seen already that is the outlier, not the timing, the count. To give that acreage figure a shape you can actually picture, by late July, more than 300,000 acres had burned in Washington, and one description that circulated locally put it at roughly the equivalent of 7 Seattles, or 3 Whidbey Islands. That was before the last week of the month, and well before Spokane. The state had not been passive about any of this. The Washington legislature appropriated $120 million for firefighting in 2026, double the previous year's budget, and the National Interagency Fire Center had forecast this in May, predicting above-average wildfire potential for eastern Washington in June, for most of the state in July, and for the entire state in August. There is one more layer underneath the drought, and it is the slowest moving of all of them. East of the Cascades, the dry forests of the interior Northwest evolved with fire. Frequent low-intensity surface fires burned through them regularly, cleaning out undergrowth, killing small trees before they could form ladders into the canopy, and keeping the stands open. A century of aggressive fire suppression removed that process. What grew back in its place is denser than anything the historical fire regime allowed, with decades of accumulated fuel on the ground and continuous vegetation from the forest floor to the treetops. Those landscapes are, in the language of the people who study them, overdue. They do not need a drought to burn badly. The drought just moves the schedule up, and the forecast for what comes after this season does not offer a reset. The medium-range outlook calls for continued warmer and drier than usual conditions, and a strengthening El Niño heading toward what forecasters have described as a super El Niño, which in the Pacific Northwest historically means a warm winter with little snow. If that verifies, the snowpack that should refill the system this coming winter will not refill it. The landscape that burned this August would go into next spring already behind, so the money was doubled. The forecast was published months in advance. The drought was declared in April. The fuel moisture was tracked all season. The particularly dangerous situation alert went out on Friday. The emergency was declared Saturday morning, and on Saturday afternoon, a fire in grass west of Spokane doubled in 20 minutes and started moving toward a river that everyone assumed would stop it. There is a version of this story where the warnings were missed, and that version would be easier to tell and easier to fix. That is not this story. This is the other version, the harder one, where everyone was right and it happened anyway. Which brings us back to the river, and to the thing a fire does in a 45-mile-an-hour wind that most people have never had explained to them. Part 4. Riverside. Riverside State Park sits on the northwest edge of Spokane, and if you have never been there, it is one of the largest state parks in Washington. Basalt outcrops, ponderosa pine, the Centennial Trail running through it, and the Spokane River carving a gorge down the middle. It is where people in that city go to walk their dogs and ride their bikes and stand on the suspension footbridge at the bowl and pitcher looking down at the water. On Saturday afternoon it became the corridor that delivered a fire into a city. The wind was out of the southwest, which pointed the fire directly northeast, and there was nothing between the ignition point and the park boundary but the same cured grass the fire had already proven it could move through. The fire pushed into Riverside State Park and it went through it fast. Trees in the dry park caught, and witnesses described flames visible above them from across the river. Then the fire maps recorded something that people who live in Spokane have been reading and rereading ever since. The fire raced down to the Spokane River. It narrowly missed the footbridge at the Bowl and Pitcher, that specific, beloved, ordinary piece of infrastructure that thousands of people have photographed. And then it crossed the water. Here is how a fire crosses a river, and it is not by burning across it. In light wind, a fire spreads by contact and by radiant heat. The flame front tilts slightly forward, the heat it throws dries and preheats the fuel immediately ahead of it, and when that fuel reaches its ignition temperature it catches, and the front advances a little. That process is slow enough that a fire break works. A road, a river, a bulldozed line, any gap wide enough that the radiant heat cannot reach across it will stop that kind of fire cold. Now put 45 miles an hour behind it. Two things change at once. First, the flame front tilts hard forward, so instead of throwing heat mostly upward, it throws it almost horizontally into the unburned fuel ahead, preheating a much longer stretch of ground at once and accelerating the rate at which each new section of fuel reaches ignition. Second, and far more importantly, the convection column above the fire becomes strong enough to lift burning material off the ground. That is called spotting. Bark plates, pine cones, chunks of burning grass, fragments of anything light enough to be picked up and dense enough to stay lit. They get carried up into the plume, pushed downwind, and they fall. If they fall in fuel dry enough to accept them, they start a new fire, which merges back into the parent fire as it arrives, which strengthens the plume, which throws more embers further. A wind-driven fire does not advance as a line, it advances as a shower. That is why the river did not stop it. The fire did not need to burn across the water. It only needed to throw something burning far enough that it landed on the other side. And on a day when the fine fuels on the far bank had a moisture content that had been described as record low, essentially every ember that landed was going to take. And it is worth being precise about the distances involved, because people underestimate them badly. Short-range spotting throws embers tens to a few hundred meters ahead of the front, and that alone is enough to defeat most roads and most rivers. Long-range spotting, driven by a strong convection column, has been documented carrying burning material a kilometre or more downwind, and in extreme plume-driven events considerably further than that. The Spokane River Gorge is wide, and it is impressive, and against a fire throwing embers in a 45-mile-an-hour wind it was a formality. There is a second consequence of spotting that matters even more for what happened next, and it is the reason firefighters hate it so much. A fire that advances by spotting does not present a single, defensible front. It presents a scattered field of new ignitions, some of them behind the line crews have just established, some of them in places nobody was watching. You cannot hold a line against a fire that keeps starting on the wrong side of it. Every ember that lands and takes is a new fire that has to be found, reached, and put out by somebody, and on that Saturday there was nobody spare to send. The Federal Situation Report for that day classified fire behaviour as extreme across all three of the Spokane area fires. For the Old Trails fire specifically, the recorded behaviour was wind-driven runs, crowning, and short-range spotting. Crowning means the fire moved into the tops of the trees, where it is no longer a surface fire and where nothing on the ground can be done about it. Short-range spotting is exactly the mechanism I just described. There is a psychological consequence to this that is worth naming, because it explains a lot of the behaviour on Saturday afternoon. Everybody in that city had a mental map of where fire could and could not go, and that map was built on features. The river, the park boundary, the big roads, the golf course, the landfill. It was a reasonable map. It was correct in a normal year. And it was wrong on the 1st of August, in a way that gave people no time to update it. When the fire crossed the river, thousands of people who had been watching a distant smoke column with detached interest went, in about a minute, from spectators to evacuees. That is why some of them were still in their houses when the knock came, and why some of them were on Strong Road in a car when they should have been 40 minutes ahead of it. They were not ignoring the danger. They were relying on a fire break that had held their entire lives. Once it was across the river, the terrain worked against everyone. The neighbourhoods of northwest Spokane sit on bluffs above the river gorge. The fire had to climb to reach them, and fire climbing a slope is a fire being handed free acceleration. Heat rises. As flames move uphill, the convection preheats the fuel above them far more efficiently than it would on flat ground, which means rate of spread increases sharply with slope, roughly doubling for every 10 degrees or so of gradient in the ranges that matter. The fire had wind pushing it and topography pulling it at the same time. It burned uphill through the city's Northside landfill. It skirted Fairmount Memorial Park. Fire maps show it throwing towering flames at the Dwight Merkel Sports Complex, then blowing through the area of the Spokane Rifle Club and into a neighborhood called Westgate Park. It hurdled West 9 Mile Road, which is a real road, with real width, and which was no more of an obstacle than the river had been, and then it reached Indian Trail. There is a specific detail from those hours that I keep coming back to. Along West 9 Mile and North Greenwood Boulevard, residents were out with garden hoses spraying down their own houses and their neighbours' houses, wetting down firewood stacked outside. One of them, Teresa Sullivan, told a reporter, "It's never been this close before. I never thought it would be up here. I'm in shock." Those people were not being reckless. That is what almost anyone does in that situation. But the reason it is worth mentioning is that within a few hours the fire department would be publicly asking them to stop. And the reason for that request tells you something about how close to the edge the city's basic infrastructure had already been pushed. By 8:20 that evening, the National Interagency Fire Centre had the Old Trails fire at 3,509 acres. That is roughly 8.5 hours after ignition. 50 acres to 3,500, with the wind still forecast to be near its peak. There is one more thing the embers did that afternoon, and it happened across the river in the other direction, in Stevens County. A fire started in the Suncrest area, and the local fire district was explicit about the cause. It was started by an ember. Wind pushed it rapidly uphill, and it burned 3 homes along a street called Meadowview. Then it kept going, and many more houses burned, and Stevens County Fire District No. 1 said plainly why. Fire resources ran short. They noted that they were able to save many houses. They were also telling you, in the flattest possible language, that some houses burned because there was nobody left to send to them. Hold on to that sentence. It is going to come back, and it is the closest thing this event has to a diagnosis. And by that point, the Old Trails fire was no longer the only thing Spokane County was fighting. Part 5. 3 fires, 1 afternoon. Shortly before 4 in the afternoon, while the Old Trails fire was pushing through Riverside State Park, a second fire ignited in the Peony Prairie area, on the northeast side of Spokane County. That one became the Fairview fire, and it created its own evacuation zone almost immediately, everything from Market Street to Forker Road, between Mount Spokane Park Drive on the north and Orchard Road on the south. Its recorded fire behaviour was the same profile as the first one: wind-driven runs crowning short-range spotting. The situation report noted that it was threatening structures and energy infrastructure. Later that same afternoon, a third fire broke out northwest of the Old Trails ignition point. That one became the Autumn Lane fire: wind-driven runs, spotting, and torching. Torching being the term for individual trees igniting from the ground up and burning through their entire crown at once, which is what a surface fire does immediately before it becomes a crown fire. 3 major fires, 1 county, 1 afternoon. I want to be careful here, because the obvious question is whether they were related, and the honest answer is that we do not know, and that the more interesting answer is that it may not matter. They were not the same fire spreading. They were geographically separated, on different sides of the county in some cases, and Fairview in particular was nowhere near Old Trails. Long-range spotting can carry embers for miles under the right plume conditions, so it is not impossible, but nobody has established it. The cause of the Old Trails fire remains under investigation, and if anything has been determined about the other 2, it has not been made public. What we can say with confidence is the thing that the Weather Service was warning about in the first place. When you have a landscape at record low fuel moisture, single-digit humidity, and gusts to 45 miles an hour across an entire region, you are not dealing with a situation where one ignition is dangerous. You're dealing with a situation where every ignition is dangerous, and the number of ignitions on any given afternoon is essentially a matter of chance. Joey Clevenger's warning about lawnmowers and dragging chains was not a throwaway line. It was a statement that on that specific day, the ordinary friction of human life in a populated county was enough. 3 fires in 1 afternoon is not evidence of a conspiracy. It is evidence of a landscape that had reached a state where the normal background rate of accidental ignition, which is running all the time, everywhere, in every county, on every day, and which almost never produces anything, was suddenly enough to produce catastrophe 3 times in 6 hours. The response to that was administrative, and it was the right call. A federal incident management team took over and merged all 3 into a single incident, the Spokane complex. That is worth explaining, because the word complex in wildfire management has a specific meaning. It is not a description of the fire's shape or its difficulty. It is a resource decision. When multiple fires are burning close enough together that they are competing for the same engines, the same aircraft, the same crews, the same airspace and the same command structure, managing them as separate incidents produces exactly the wrong result. 3 teams bidding against each other for a pool of resources that does not have enough in it. Merging them into a complex puts one incident commander in charge of allocating everything across all 3, which means the decision to form the Spokane complex is itself a piece of evidence. It is the system formally acknowledging that there were not enough resources to fight these fires as 3 separate fires. I also want to define 2 of the terms in those situation reports, because they are not decoration. They are a fire behavior analyst's shorthand for how bad something is, and they escalate in a specific order. A surface fire burns through grass, litter, and low vegetation. It is dangerous, but it is fightable. Crews can work directly against it, dozers can cut line ahead of it, and it can be stopped. Torching is the next step. An individual tree ignites from the base, and the flame runs all the way up through its crown at once, throwing a burst of heat and a shower of embers. Torching is what you see immediately before a fire changes character, because each torching tree is both a signal that the fuel is dry enough and a mechanism for lofting more embers. Crowning is the step after that. The fire moves into the continuous canopy and spreads from treetop to treetop, decoupled from the ground entirely. Once a fire is crowning, ground-based suppression is finished. You're not stopping it. You're getting out of its way, protecting what you can on the flanks, and waiting for the wind or the fuel to change. All 3 of the Spokane fires recorded torching or crowning. All 3 recorded wind-driven runs. All 3 recorded spotting. That is not a fire that people failed to fight properly. That is a fire that had already left the range in which fighting it is a coherent activity. Here is where those 3 stood by Sunday evening. Old Trails, 3,619 acres, 0% contained. Autumn Lane, 3,351 acres, 0% contained. Fairview, 1,056 acres, 0% contained. Combined, 7,708 acres, 0% contained. Look at Autumn Lane for a second, because that number should stop you. The Federal Situation Report on Saturday had it at roughly 900 acres. By Sunday evening it was 3,351. The fire that started last and smallest had nearly overtaken the fire that started the whole event 4 hours earlier and drove the evacuation of a city. And I need to explain the 0, because it is the single most misunderstood number in wildfire coverage. 0% contained does not mean nobody is fighting it. It does not mean the fire is unopposed, or that it is still growing at full speed, or that everything is on fire right now. Containment measures one specific thing, the fraction of a fire's perimeter that is enclosed by a secured control line. A control line can be a bulldozed strip, a hand-dug line, a road, a river, or an edge that crews have deliberately burned out and are confident will hold. So a fire can have thousands of people assigned to it, air tankers flying it, and structure defense crews working through the night, and still report 0%, because none of the perimeter has been secured yet. When the Spokane complex reported 7,708 acres at 0% containment, it was making a precise statement. Every single foot of the edge of that fire was still capable of moving. But the acreage was never the story here. 7,000 acres is not a large fire by Western standards. Washington had a fire burning at 131,000 acres at the same moment. The Kaiser Canyon fire, lightning started near Nespelem more than 2 weeks earlier, roughly 17 times the size of the entire Spokane complex, with over 1,000 personnel assigned to it. And almost nobody outside the region has heard of the Kaiser Canyon fire because acreage and destruction are only loosely related. A fire can burn 131,000 acres of remote ground and destroy nothing that anybody counts. A fire can burn 7,000 acres and take a neighborhood off the map. The variable that decides which one you get is not how big the fire is. It is what is standing in the 7,000 acres it happens to pick. The Old Trails fire picked the northwest side of a city of roughly 230,000 people. And there is a grim irony in the geography, because the fire went through some of the very things that make that part of Spokane worth living in. Riverside State Park is one of the largest state parks in Washington, and it is the reason people build houses on those bluffs in the first place. The trails, the gorge, the pines, the river. The Centennial Trail runs through it. The Bowl and Pitcher footbridge is on postcards. What makes a neighborhood beautiful on the edge of a state park is precisely what makes it exposed. Continuous vegetation running right up to the property line, with nothing in between. That is the wildland-urban interface in one sentence. It is not a mistake anyone made. It is the trade that comes with the view. What made this one historic was what those 7,000 acres happened to contain. Part 6. Indian Trail. Indian Trail is a residential neighborhood on the northwest side of Spokane. Houses, cul-de-sacs, an elementary school, a Catholic church and school on West Indian Trail Road. Ordinary American suburban geography, sitting on a bluff above a river gorge, backed up against open ground. At about 4:30 in the afternoon, flames and smoke were cascading over the trees next to the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary Catholic Church on West Indian Trail Road. Crews were on scene trying to protect the church and school. Police vehicles were driving north on North Indian Trail Road, while residents drove south, away from it. Some people had to drive past houses that were already burning to get down into the city. By 7:30 in the evening, homes around Indian Trail Elementary School were on fire, and the smoke had blotted out most of the sun. Reporters on the ground described home after home catching and going up along with the trees, and loud explosions audible through the smoke. Those explosions are not mysterious, and they are worth understanding because they are one of the reasons structure fires in a wildland-urban interface behave differently from forest fire. Propane tanks, vehicle fuel tanks, compressed gas cylinders in garages, pressurized aerosols. When a wildland fire reaches a residential street, it is not encountering wood and vegetation. It is encountering a dense concentration of stored fuel and stored pressure, spaced 15 or 20 feet apart, in a geometry that lets each burning house preheat and ignite the next one. That is the central and uncomfortable fact about a wildland-urban interface fire once it gets going in a subdivision. Past a certain point, the houses stop being things the fire is threatening and start being the fuel the fire is running on. The fire that took Indian Trail did not need the grass anymore, and the way most of those houses actually caught is not the way people imagine it either. The mental image is a wall of flame arriving at the front door. What the post-fire investigations of these events keep finding instead is embers. The same lofted burning fragments that carried the fire across the river arrive at a house minutes to hours before the flame front does, and they get into attic vents, into gutters packed with dry needles, into the gap under a deck, into a woodpile stacked against a wall, into a doormat. The house then burns from a small ignition on or inside it, on its own schedule, often after the main front has already passed, which is why in these fires you get the pattern that looks inexplicable in the aftermath photographs. One house gone to the foundation, the house next to it untouched, the house after that gone. It is not random. It is the difference between a screened vent and an unscreened one, a cleaned gutter and a full one. Multiply that across a subdivision, on a night with a 45-mile-an-hour wind and single-digit humidity, and you get entire blocks going at once, which is exactly what happened in Indian Trail and on 5 Mile Prairie, where officials would later find whole streets of houses burned down to their foundations. The wind pushed flame and smoke across North Indian Trail Road so fast that firefighters were yelling at people nearby to run. Monica Opfer lives near Indian Trail Elementary. She watched the fire come close enough that she could feel the heat off it. She grabbed her dog, Mabel, and her medication, and she left. After 8 in the evening, she told a reporter, "I think I lost my home. I don't know where I'm going to go." Bobby Atwood was photographed carrying her dog, Luna, away from a house on West Euclid Road that had burned. Luna got out with burned paws. Atwood said several of her other pets were still missing. Nancy and Darrell Wagner, 73 and 76 years old, stood outside an evacuation centre with their dog, Fritz, yapping nervously in the grass. Neighbours had told them they had already seen houses in the area burn. The Wagners grabbed the dog and not much else. "We've lived in that house for 31 years now," Darrell said. And then Nancy added 5 words that are, to me, the most devastating sentence anyone said out loud during this entire event. Well, if it's still standing. That was Saturday evening, and neither of them knew. The fire kept going. From Indian Trail it pushed onto West Strong Road, in the area known as 5 Mile Prairie, by early evening. 5 Mile Prairie is a residential plateau north of the city, and there is a piece of local history attached to it that has taken on a very different weight in the last 48 hours. Candace Mumm, a former Spokane City Councilwoman who evacuated from 5 Mile that afternoon, told a reporter that the neighborhood had pushed for years for a fire station to be built on the prairie. During her time on the council, the city actually bought land for one. No money was ever set aside to build it. "We always worried about this," she said. "We kept being told it was not a priority." Her house was still standing when she said that, from a relative's home where the family had gathered. She described the fire as having come very, very close. Meanwhile, the institutions were emptying out. The Mangrandstaff VA Medical Center evacuated patients and staff, with some patients transferred to regional hospitals for care. Spokane Transit Authority buses were pressed into service to help move people out of the VA. At the Spokane Health and Rehabilitation Home on North Assembly Street, residents were being evacuated and waiting outside in the shade and the grass for buses to arrive. Whitworth University evacuated as well, with security guards going door to door across campus to make sure nobody was left. Crystal Harris works as a social worker at the VA hospital, and her home is nearby. "You just get out so fast you don't even think. You've just got to get out," she said. "You see it and it's terrifying. You're just thinking, get my stuff." Some of the scenes on those roads are hard to put in a script. One boy ran up to a group of firefighters and asked them to go check on his brother, who was in a house above where the fire was burning. A woman screamed at firefighters to go save her husband and her son, who has a disability, but she did not speak English and could not make herself understood. A family member later found her crying on the side of the road and told her they were safe. Bob Moore drove up Government Way trying to get to his own property and was stopped by a Spokane police officer. "You got to let me go up there, man," he called from his truck window. The officer told him he could not let him up there right now. "My shop, my house. I need to protect my house," Moore said. The officer made a call, tried to find a way to get him through and could not. "I'm sorry," he told him. Moore's wife had already grabbed their go-bags and their dogs and was waiting at the bottom of the hill. She had called him and said, "You have to come home right now." At the roadblock on North Government Way, other people were crying and pleading with police to let them up. There was nothing the officers could do. Spokane Public Schools could not even tell what was happening to its own buildings. The roads to the schools were closed, and the district's security cameras had outrun their backup power supply. A spokesman said Saturday evening that they had no eyes on those properties at all. That is a small detail, and it is the kind of thing that gets lost in a disaster this size. But it is a good measurement of the state of things. A modern school district with a camera system covering its own campuses went blind because the power had been out long enough for the batteries to die, and it had no way to know whether its schools were burning. Spokane County Commissioner Al French, who represents both the West Plains and the Indian Trail neighborhoods, told reporters that the damage left behind could be, in his word, tragic. His advice was not about firefighting at all. "If you're not in the path of the fires, reach out to friends, because a lot of folks are going to need a safe place to reside and hold up in until this risk goes away," he said. "Be a good neighbor and help your neighbor." That is what a public official says when he already understands that the response phase is over for a large number of people, and the recovery phase has started, even though the fire is still burning, and nobody, at that hour, had any real idea how many houses had already been lost. Part 7. Leave now. This may be your only notice. 60,000 people were ordered out of their homes inside Spokane city limits. That is the number that separates this from a bad wildfire and turns it into the largest emergency movement of civilians that most of the people involved will ever see. More than 65,000 were under evacuation orders across the affected area. Roughly 5,000 homes emptied, and it all happened between about 3:30 in the afternoon and the middle of the night. Sheriff John Nowles called in every deputy he had to run door-to-door evacuations. Chandra Fox, the Deputy Director of Emergency Management for the county, was on the phone with the State Department of Natural Resources and other agencies, trying to find more wildland firefighters. Spokane police were simultaneously trying to help residents get out, and it went about as well as an evacuation of that scale on that timeline can go, which is to say, it very nearly did not. The zone did not arrive all at once either, and that is part of what made it so hard. The first level 3 orders inside the city went out just before 3:30 in the afternoon, and then they expanded, through the afternoon, through the evening, outward, again and again, as the fire kept doing things the previous boundary had not accounted for. The initial line was everything north of Francis Avenue and west of Division Street. The Fairview fire on the other side of the county generated a completely separate zone running from Market Street to Forker Road, between Mount Spokane Park Drive and Orchard Road. If you pull up the emergency communications map from that night, the pink areas are level 3, the yellow areas are level 2, and by 7 in the morning on Sunday, large parts of northern Spokane County were still pink. The orders had held steady overnight, which is its own kind of information. Nobody was confident enough about any of it to let people go home. For anyone unfamiliar with the system, Level 1 means get ready, be aware, have a plan, know your route. Level 2 means get set, be prepared to leave at a moment's notice, and if you have livestock, animals, medical needs or anything else that makes you slow, go now rather than later. Level 3 means go, immediately, and do not stop to gather anything. The problem with a stage system in a fire like this one is that the fire does not respect the stages. A neighbourhood can go from level 2 to burning faster than the notification can propagate, and some of the people evacuating from Indian Trail and 5 Mile Prairie went from a knock on the door to flames on the street in the time it took to load a car. Jason Lasko lives on 5 Mile Prairie. When the first evacuation notice came, he was not especially worried. The fire seemed far off, and his instinct was to start locking down the house and gathering things. Then he noticed how thick the smoke had become, and he sped up. He got into his pickup and headed east on Strong Road. Strong Road was completely gridlocked, he said. He sat at a standstill for 30 minutes or more. Eventually, police managed to turn the westbound traffic around and convert the road into 2 eastbound lanes, and it started moving. State Senator Marcus Riccelli evacuated from his own home on 5 Mile, a little after 3:30 going out via Austin Road. A drive that normally takes 5 minutes took about 40. Some drivers had started going up the wrong side of the road before police reorganized the lanes. Ordinary citizens were down at the bottom of the hill directing traffic themselves. It was a little bit dicey for a while, Riccelli said. Some people, I think, were moving towards a little bit of panic. I want to be very direct about why this matters, because gridlock during a wildfire evacuation is not an inconvenience. It is the single mechanism by which these events kill people. In nearly every catastrophic wildfire that has produced mass casualties in the last decade, the deaths did not happen in houses. They happened in cars, on roads, in the gap between the moment people decided to leave and the moment the fire arrived. Residential street networks in hillside subdivisions are designed for a morning commute, not for every household in the neighbourhood attempting to leave simultaneously in the same 10-minute window. Add smoke that reduces visibility to nothing, add people who turned back for a pet or a document, add a fire moving faster than the traffic, and the road becomes the trap. That is why the Level 3 language reads the way it does. Leave now. This may be your only notice. It is not written to frighten people. It is written because the difference between leaving on the first notice and leaving on the second one is, in some of these events, the difference between the 2 outcomes. And the thing that Sheriff Nowells kept saying on Saturday night is the reason I am spending this much time on it. We're still having way too many people refusing to evacuate, he said. Too many people refusing, not too few warnings, not unclear instructions. Refusal, on a day when the National Weather Service had issued a warning level it had never used in the history of the state. That is not a criticism of the people who stayed, and I want to say that carefully, because it is very easy to be righteous about this from a distance. People stay for reasons that make complete sense from inside a house. They stay because they have animals they cannot move. They stay because they have been through fire scares before and nothing happened. They stay because the last time they left, they came back to find they had panicked over nothing. They stay because everything they own is inside and leaving feels like abandoning it. They stay because a garden hose feels like doing something and driving away feels like giving up. Nowells told people who did evacuate to prepare to be away from their homes and property for at least 24 to 36 hours. The animals were a real problem, and a large one. The Spokane County Fair and Expo Center opened space both for people with RVs and for evacuated animals. An animal shelter opened in Spokane Valley for pets. Out in the county, in the farm and ranch country, people were organizing horse trailers among themselves, asking around for anyone with the capacity to move livestock because there is no municipal system for evacuating a pasture. One woman, Angela Mullen, was getting ready to take a nap near the 5-mile park and ride when someone knocked on her door and said, "Hurry up, we need to get out of here." She gathered 3 dogs and a cat and left. "I didn't even know this was going to even happen," she said. That is the honest experience of most of the 60,000. Not a slow build of dread. A knock and then a decision with no information behind it, made in under a minute, about which parts of your life fit in the car. The city of Spokane opened its evacuation center at the Spokane Convention Center on West Spokane Falls Boulevard, and it opened it there specifically because an earlier center at Spokane Falls Community College had lost power. Traffic and Spokane Transit Authority buses arrived through the evening. American Red Cross volunteers scrambled to set up medical relief. Buses were unloading people from nursing homes and assisted living facilities. 410 families slept in that convention center on Saturday night. Kayla Sharp arrived there at about 8:30 in the evening with her husband and their 6-month-old baby. What they were looking for specifically was a changing table. Sharp is 19, born in Spokane, and by her own account used to fire season. This is not a person unfamiliar with the routine of a smoky August. But she said she could not believe she was still holding it together. "This one's different because I have a child now," she said. Down along Northwest Boulevard, people who were not in the evacuation zone had gathered on the ledge by the road to watch. Across the river, flames covered a hillside a few miles away. Cars fled bumper to bumper for miles below them, while people who were out of danger watched from picnic blankets. That image, the evacuation and the audience in the same frame, is one that will probably define this event in people's memories. Michael Keller has lived in Spokane for 30 years. "I've never seen it this bad," he said. "It has never in my life been this close." His wife and adult son had just driven toward the evacuation zone to try to recover things from a relative's empty house. "I don't know if they'll even get in," he said. "They're trying to save stuff, but I'm really worried about them if they do make it in." That is the whole problem in one sentence, from a man standing on a road watching his own family drive toward a fire to save objects. And while all of that was happening, the fire department was discovering the limits of what a fire department is. Part 8. The Limits of a Fire Department. Assistant Spokane, Fire Chief Lance Dahl said something on Saturday that I think deserves to be quoted in full because it is not an excuse and it is not a deflection. It is a physics statement. "I will tell you in a wind-driven event there is not a fire department in the US that can handle a wind-driven event this size. Not this department, not a department this size. Any of them. None. Here is why that is true rather than defensive. Direct attack on a wildfire, putting crews and engines at the head of the fire and stopping it there, only works if people can move faster than the fire does. Every suppression tactic in the manual has a rate of spread beyond which it stops being a tactic and starts being a way to get firefighters killed. Hand crews cutting line, dozers cutting line, engines with hose lays, all of them have a ceiling. Past that ceiling you cannot attack the head of the fire at all. You go to the flanks, you go to structure protection, you go to point defense of things you can actually save, and you wait for the weather to change. Spokane put roughly 100 firefighters on duty that Saturday, against a normal shift of 69. That is a 45% increase, made in advance, based on a correct forecast. And it made no difference to the head of the fire, because the fire was moving with a 45-mile-an-hour push through fuel at record low moisture. There is no staffing number that fixes that. You could have tripled it. What those 100 people actually did all afternoon and all night was structure protection, which is the grinding house-by-house work of wetting down a roof, pulling a woodpile away from a wall, cutting a garden fence to make an escape route, and deciding, in about 10 seconds, which of the 4 houses on this block can still be saved and which cannot. Reporting from the scene described crews working around homes trying to keep fire off them while the main front went past, and then the water started running out. Chief Dahl asked residents publicly to stop turning on their sprinklers. "We're already running into water issues in some of our water towers and our pumping capabilities because we're using so much," he said. "We have so many in town needing water, it's putting a strain on the system." That is a detail people skip past, and it is one of the most important operational facts of the entire night. A municipal water system is built around a modelled peak demand. Storage in towers and reservoirs, pump size to refill that storage, main size to deliver a certain flow to a certain number of simultaneous users, plus a fire flow reserve for a structure fire or two happening at once. It is a system with a designed ceiling, and the ceiling assumes that the city is not all doing the same thing at the same moment. Now put a wildfire on the edge of the city. Fire engines are drawing from hydrants at high flow across an entire district. Thousands of homeowners simultaneously turn on sprinklers and hoses to protect their own property. Some of the houses that have already burned have opened, broken supply lines pouring water into nothing, and parts of the pumping infrastructure may be running on backup or not running at all, because the power is out, pressure drops. And when pressure drops in a hydrant network, the engines that are actively protecting houses lose their supply. That is the reason for the request. Every sprinkler running on an intact lawn was competing with a hose line at a house that was already on fire. There is no villain in that. Not one person watering their roof was doing anything unreasonable. It is simply a case where thousands of individually rational decisions summed to a collective failure, and the only tool available to fix it was to get on television and ask. The power situation was its own chain of consequences. Avista Utilities reported roughly 40,000 customers without power in the Spokane area. Many of those outages were deliberate, preemptive shutoffs across the city, including in areas that were not in the evacuation zone at all. That practice is called a public safety power shutoff, and the logic behind it is straightforward. Power lines in high wind can arc, can slap together, can drop, and can throw sparks into fuel. In several catastrophic wildfires elsewhere in the West, that is exactly how the fire started. So the utility makes a trade, turn off the electricity to a region, accept the enormous disruption of doing so, and remove the ignition risk. Avista had warned on Friday that it might do this. It did it. Avista's spokesman, David Vowles, stated that the Old Trails fire did not start from Avista infrastructure, though parts of the company's system were damaged by the fire. The investigation into the cause is open, and I will come back to that. But it is worth noting that the utility's own behaviour in the days before is not the behaviour of an organisation being careless with ignition risk. Then there is the air. Air tankers and scooper aircraft were working the complex, the large fixed wing tankers that drop retardant, and the amphibious scoopers that skim water off a lake and dump it on the fire over and over all day. In a wind-driven event where ground crews cannot approach the head of the fire, aircraft are frequently the only asset still capable of doing anything at the front, which is why crews made two specific public requests during this event. The first was about drones. If a single unauthorized drone is sighted anywhere over a fire, every aircraft on that fire is grounded, not slowed. Grounded immediately, because a mid-air collision between a drone and a low-flying air tanker full of retardant is a mass casualty event waiting to happen. Recovering from a drone incursion, clearing the airspace, confirming it is clear, getting aircraft back into the rotation, costs hours. On a day like Saturday, hours of grounded aviation is measured in houses. The second was about boats. When scoopers are drawing water from a lake, they come in low and fast along the surface. A recreational boat in the drafting lane does not just create a hazard. It shuts down the scooping run entirely, and the aircraft has to find somewhere else to fill. Both of those requests are, in a sense, embarrassing to have to make, but they get made in every one of these events, which tells you they are necessary. It is worth understanding what those aircraft can and cannot do, because there is a persistent public belief that air tankers put fires out. They do not. The red retardant that gets dropped from the large tankers is not water, and it is not there to extinguish anything. It is a slurry of fire-retardant salts, thickener and dye, and its job is to coat unburned fuel ahead of the fire so that when the flame arrives, that fuel does not ignite as readily. It buys a line. Somebody on the ground still has to come and hold that line, or the fire eventually works around it or through it. Water drops from scoopers are closer to direct suppression, but they are still measured in seconds of effect against a fire front that is regenerating continuously. In a wind-driven run, aviation is not winning. It is slowing things down in specific places so that people on the ground can get in front of a specific house, or keep a specific road open. That is why losing aviation for hours to a drone sighting is not an inconvenience. It removes the only tool still functioning at the head of the fire. So by late Saturday night, a fire department at maximum staffing that could not attack the fire, a water system losing pressure, 40,000 customers dark, aircraft dependent on the public voluntarily staying out of the way, and mutual aid arriving from Coeur d'Alene, from more than a dozen states, and from Australia. And still, 9 hours after the fire was first reported, the officials standing in front of the cameras could not tell anyone how bad it was. Part 9. When the sun came up. Major General Gent Welsh is Washington's Adjutant General, the officer who commands the state's National Guard. He has been in uniform for 38 years. At a news conference on Saturday, he said the fire conditions were the worst he had seen in his entire career. And then he said the thing that everybody in the region has been repeating since. When the sun sets and the sun rises, we're going to be in shock. He was right. And the specific way in which he was right is the most quietly devastating fact of this whole event. On Saturday night, city and county officials could not answer basic questions. 9 hours after the fire was reported, they could not say whether there were injuries. Mayor Lisa Brown, asked about property losses, said, "We're not in a place right now where we can discuss the magnitude of the property destruction." Sheriff Nowles, described by the reporters in the room as red-faced and visibly exhausted, explained that the situation was so dynamic that there had been no opportunity to get an accurate count of structures or homes lost. But he gave the number he had. He said he had heard estimates from fire chiefs that around 50 to 100 structures may have burned. 50 to 100. At 6 o'clock the following morning, damage assessment teams began working the burn area, and Cody Rohrbach, the fire chief of Spokane County Fire District 3, the same man who had called Saturday the most significant fire weather event of the year, confirmed the figure for the Old Trails fire alone. 640 structures. Sit with the gap between those two numbers for a moment. 50 to 100 from the people closest to it at the end of the night. 640 from the first light of morning. The real figure was somewhere between 6 and 13 times the estimate. I want to be extremely clear that this is not a failure by Sheriff Nowles or by the fire chiefs who gave him that estimate. Those people were not guessing lazily. They were reporting what their crews could actually see, and their crews could not see anything. The smoke had blotted out the sun by mid-evening. The power was out across the district. The neighbourhoods were dark, full of smoke and on fire. Crews were fully committed to protecting houses and moving people, not counting foundations. The gap between 50 and 640 is not a measure of anyone's competence. It is a measure of how completely the event exceeded the ability of the people standing inside it to perceive it. That is what Welsh meant. He was not predicting the number. He was predicting that nobody would know the number until daylight, and that the number would be worse than anyone in that room could currently imagine. By Sunday morning it was worse still. The Washington State Emergency Operations Center put the total for the Spokane area at approximately 700 structures, including homes. Roughly 5,000 more structures were considered threatened, and officials were explicit that this was preliminary, that damage assessment teams had not reached every area, that some places were still too dangerous to enter, and that the number would rise. It is worth knowing how that count is actually produced, because it explains why it moves. Damage assessment after a wildfire is done by teams working street by street, physically, on foot and in vehicles, categorizing every structure they can reach: destroyed, major damage, minor damage, or unaffected. It is slow. It requires the area to be safe enough to enter, which means the fire has to have moved on, downed power lines have to be identified, and unstable structures have to be avoided. Which is why the first number out of any of these events is always partial, always low, and always from whichever neighbourhoods happen to be reachable first. What those teams found in the areas they could reach was entire blocks in the Indian Trail neighbourhood and on 5 Mile Prairie burned down to their foundations. Not damaged, not partially lost. Foundations. There is also a category question that will shape the final figure. The word structures does not mean houses. It means anything with a roof and walls that gets counted. Homes, yes, but also garages, sheds, barns, outbuildings, shops, and commercial buildings. In a mixed rural and suburban area like the West Plains and the Spokane City fringe, the ratio of structures to actual homes is usually somewhere around 2 to 1. When the final accounting comes, expect the homes number to be substantially lower than the structures number, and expect that to be reported as though it is a correction. It will not be. It is a different measurement, and the other number had not moved at all. 0% contained. Governor Ferguson flew to Spokane on Sunday morning. He requested a federal emergency declaration to unlock additional federal resources. FEMA authorized federal funds through the Fire Management Assistance Grant Program, which covers up to 75% of a state's eligible firefighting costs. A mechanism designed for exactly this. a state whose suppression budget is being consumed faster than it can be replenished. The burn ban Ferguson had issued on Saturday morning stays in place through September 30th, covering most outdoor and agricultural burning statewide. That is a 2-month prohibition on activity that is otherwise a normal and necessary part of running farmland in eastern Washington, and the state imposed it because the calculation had shifted that far. Mayor Brown, at a Sunday afternoon news conference, gave the sentence that has become the headline everywhere. The fires, she said, are really the worst natural disaster our region has faced. Some officials have gone further and suggested that the Spokane area fires may prove to be the most destructive wildfire event in Washington state history. The claim that this is the most destructive fire event in state history is worth handling carefully, because the record it would be breaking is only 3 years old, and it belongs to the same county. In August of 2023, 2 fires north and west of Spokane destroyed a combined 710 structures. The state's chief deputy fire marshal at the time said it was fair to call them collectively the most destructive set of fires Washington had experienced. The Spokane complex is currently sitting at roughly 640 to 700, with the count explicitly described as preliminary and rising, and with 0% containment. Whether it takes the record depends on numbers that do not exist yet. But the reason officials are already saying it out loud is that the 2023 fires took 5 days to reach their final figure. This one reached a comparable number in a single afternoon and night. By Sunday, the response had scaled accordingly. More than 4,000 personnel were working eastern Washington, drawn from a dozen states and from Australia, with larger air tankers and super scoopers assigned to the complex. There was exactly one piece of good news in the whole weekend, and it did not come from anything anyone did. Sunday brought cooler temperatures and lighter winds shifting around to the north, and forward progress on the Fairview and Old Trails perimeters was largely stopped. I need to be honest about what that is and is not. That is not containment. That is not suppression succeeding. That is weather. The same variable that made Saturday catastrophic made Sunday survivable, and it did so on its own schedule, without regard to anything that 4,000 firefighters in Washington state wanted. The pause in the fire's growth was granted, not earned, and even inside that pause, the fire that started last kept growing. By Sunday evening, Autumn Lane had ballooned to 3,351 acres and had nearly overtaken Old Trails. As of this recording, no deaths have been confirmed. I want to state that as precisely as officials have stated it, because it is being reported in a way that sounds more final than it is. Officials have said there are no confirmed fatalities. They have also said that large portions of the burn area have not been searched, and that the potential for lives to be lost remains. Those are 2 different statements, and both of them are currently true. If you want to help, the city of Spokane has set up a donation portal, and if you are in a level 3 zone, do not go back to check on your property until officials say it is safe, no matter how strong the urge is. That is not a formality. In the days after a fire like this, the hazards are downed power lines, unstable structures, hotspots under debris, and the very real possibility that the wind comes back. Because the pause is not the end of this, and to understand why, you have to look at what else was already burning in Washington before Spokane ever caught. Part 10. The fires that were already burning. Here is the sentence that reframes everything I have told you so far. On the Friday before Spokane burned, Washington state already had 10 large wildland fires going, covering roughly 200,000 acres, with about 4,000 personnel committed to them. The Old Trails fire did not arrive in a state that was ready for it. It arrived in a state that was already fully engaged somewhere else. Every one of Washington's 5 biggest fires as of that Friday had been started by lightning in the second half of July. That is the detail that gets lost in the coverage of the Spokane story, and it is important for a reason I will come back to. Lightning-caused fires behave differently from the kind that started outside Spokane, and understanding why makes the state's position clearer. Summer thunderstorms in the interior northwest are frequently dry. The rain evaporates before it reaches the ground, but the lightning does not. A single storm cell moving across a mountain range can put down dozens of strikes over an enormous area in an afternoon, in terrain with no roads. Some of those strikes ignite immediately, others smoulder in a snag or a duff layer for days before they surface as an open flame, which is why fires appear in the days after a storm rather than during it. The practical consequence is that lightning does not hand you one fire. It hands you a scattered field of them, in the worst possible places to reach, all at once. That is how Washington ended up with 5 large fires in its northern tier simultaneously, and it is why more than 1,000 personnel were tied up on a single one of them. Kaiser Canyon, 1 mile south of Nespelem, was the largest active fire in the state, 131,312 acres, 29% contained, with more than 1,030 personnel assigned to it from state and tribal agencies. It had been started by lightning near Nespelem more than 2 weeks earlier. Moderate, 17 miles southwest of Inchelium on the Colville Reservation, 35,600 acres, 27% contained. Little Giant, 30 miles northwest of Leavenworth, 28,494 acres, 0% contained. Ptarmigan, 20 miles northwest of Mazama, 12,000 acres, 0% contained. Sinlahikin, 12 miles west of Tonasket, 11,316 acres, 0% contained. Add them up, and you get well over 200,000 acres burning in the northern half of eastern Washington, while a fire chief in Spokane was warning about the weather event of the year. But I want to focus on the Modrite fire specifically, because it did something between that Thursday and that Friday that almost nobody outside the fire community would recognize as significant, and which I think is the single most alarming number in this entire story. Its containment went down. On Thursday, the Modrite fire was 63% contained. On Friday, it was 30% contained. And in the same 24 hours, it gained roughly 17,500 acres. Think about what that actually means. Containment is a measure of secured perimeter. Firefighters had built and held line around nearly 2/3 of that fire. Then, in a day, the fire got out, grew so fast and so far that the amount of its edge which crews had secured fell by more than half, even though nobody stopped working and nobody gave anything back voluntarily. Falling containment is what it looks like when a fire outruns the people fighting it, not stalls them, outruns them. It is the fire's growth rate exceeding the rate at which human beings with machines can construct a line around it, and it is genuinely rare to see it stated that plainly in a public situation report. The consequences were immediate. The Modrite fire's footprint passed 37,000 acres, with 639 personnel on it, and it pushed north toward the town of Inchelium, which had already evacuated on Thursday. Level 3 Go Now orders covered Inchelium itself along with Lynx Mountain, Rainy Ridge, Spud Cellar Road, Round Lake, Twin Lakes, Box Canyon, Stranger Mountain, Covada, Kewa, Apex and Rogers Bar. Level 2 Get Set warnings covered the northeastern edge of the reservation. A FEMA administrator named Vincent Makovich stated that the threats from the Modrite fire could constitute a major disaster, and listed what was in its path in Inchelium: the community centre, the Tribal Emergency Medical Services building, the fire and rescue buildings, parks, the library, a childcare centre, a wood treatment plant and a campground. A resident of Inchelium, describing what the fire looked like when it came, said it was as though a volcano erupted. On the western edge of the same reservation, the Kaiser Canyon fire had its own Level 3 zones: Haley Creek, Armstrong Meadows, Ojai Lake, Empire Creek Road, Central Peak, and Level 2 notices over Nespelem, Omak Lake, Moses Mountain, West Fork, Coyote Creek and Cache Creek. State Route 155 was closed in 2 separate places, and southwest of Colville, the Bradeen Hill fire, which started on July 25th, had burned nearly 4,200 acres at 3% containment and was about 1.5 miles from the town of Gifford, with 318 firefighters assigned. A Red Cross shelter was open at Jenkins High School. Evacuees could take large animals to the Arden Rodeo grounds, where they had to care for them themselves. Now hold all of that in your head at once, and go back to the Stevens County Fire District that said houses burned in Suncrest because resources ran short. This is the mechanism that almost never gets discussed, and I think it is the actual failure mode of this event. Wildfire suppression is a queue. Every jurisdiction plans for a certain number of simultaneous incidents based on what it has locally, and mutual aid agreements backfill anything beyond that from neighbouring jurisdictions, then from the state, then from a national dispatch system that moves crews and aircraft around the country according to priority. In a normal year, that system has enormous depth. A new fire start gets an aggressive initial attack, several engines, a crew, aircraft if needed, and the overwhelming majority of fires die in the first hours because of it. But that depth is finite, and it is shared. When 10 large fires are already burning in one state, with 4,000 people committed, the engines that would normally arrive fast at the 11th fire are not sitting in a station nearby. They are already assigned. Which is why Washington was receiving crews and engines from more than a dozen other states, including 5 fire engines barged in from Alaska, and personnel from Florida, and firefighters from Australia, because the depth of the queue had been drawn down far enough that the state was reaching to the other side of the planet. And on a day when 3 new fires start at once in a single county at record low fuel moisture, in a 45-mile-an-hour wind, initial attack does not happen the way it normally would, not because anybody made a mistake, because there was nothing left in the queue. That is the number that does not appear in any individual fire's statistics. It lives in the gap between what a fire could have been held to and what it became. Stevens County put it in a sentence: many houses burned as fire resources ran short, and Washington was not the only place in this position. It was not even close. Part 11. Oregon. Directly to the south of the fires I've just described, Oregon was having the worst wildfire year in its modern history. As of late July, nearly 1.8 million acres had burned in Oregon. Not thousands, not hundreds of thousands. 1.8 million acres, with the peak of the season still to come, on a pace to break the state's modern record. For scale, the entire Spokane complex, the fire that destroyed a piece of Washington's second-largest city and put 65,000 people out of their homes, is about 7,700 acres. Oregon's season was running at more than 230 times that, and it was still going. And the reason is the same reason, which is what makes this worth spending time on rather than filing away as a separate story. Remember the snowpack numbers. Washington was at 52% of normal at the April peak. Oregon was at 14%, 14% of normal, in the state where the Cascade Range is the water tower for everything east of it. The mountains that should have been holding the season's water supply in April were functionally bare. That is what produces 1.8 million acres. Not a single bad fire. A landscape where the moisture clock ran out in spring rather than midsummer, so that every ignition from May onward, and there are always ignitions, from lightning, from equipment, from vehicles, from all the ordinary friction of a populated state, landed in fuel that was already ready. Fuel moisture in the Oregon Cascades was tracking below normal all season, and like eastern Washington, was hitting record lows in places. Live and dead fuels cured far earlier than normal. The two states were running the same experiment, at slightly different intensities at the same time, and Oregon carries the same structural problem east of its Cascade crest that Washington carries east of its own. Those dry pine forests were shaped by frequent low-intensity fire that a century of suppression removed. The stands that grew in its absence are denser, younger, more continuous from the ground into the canopy, and holding decades of accumulated fuel that the historical fire regime would have consumed a dozen times over. Give that landscape a 14% snowpack and a July of dry lightning, and you're not going to get a normal season. You're going to get the season Oregon is having. 1.8 million acres also produces something that reaches a long way beyond the fire line. Smoke from Pacific Northwest fires spread across much of the United States in late July, reaching as far as the mid-Atlantic and the southeast. That is a continental-scale plume from a regional fire complex, and it means that tens of millions of people who will never see a flame from these fires have already breathed them. Fine particulate matter, the fraction small enough to pass through the lungs and into the bloodstream, is the mechanism, and it does not care about state lines any more than the fire cared about the river. And on August 1st they were hit by the same weather system. That is the part that makes this one event rather than two. The dry, cold front that Joey Clevenger described, the one that produced the winds that drove the Old Trails fire across the Spokane River, was not a Spokane weather event. It swept across all of Washington and into parts of Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. The particularly dangerous situation conditions were not confined to one county or one state. Gusts of 40 to 50 miles per hour were expected across eastern Oregon and eastern Washington on Saturday afternoon and early evening. So when I tell you that Spokane lost 640 structures on Saturday, understand that Saturday was a regional event that happened to produce its most photogenic catastrophe in one city, in the same way that a hurricane's landfall city becomes the story while the entire coastline is being worked over. The thing that makes a dry cold front so dangerous, incidentally, is worth a sentence, because it sounds like it should be a relief. Cold fronts usually mean weather changing for the better. What a dry front delivers instead is the wind without the rain, a sharp shift in wind direction and speed as the boundary passes, gusty and unstable behind it, with humidity that stays low or drops further. For an existing fire, the wind shift is the most dangerous part of all, because the long flank of a fire, the side crews have been working, the side that has been relatively quiet, abruptly becomes the head. A perimeter that people have spent hours building line along can, in the space of one frontal passage, become the front edge of a run. Out in eastern Oregon, that same pattern was being met by people with dozers on their own land. There have been ranchers in Oregon fighting to protect their ground, their livestock and their livelihoods essentially alone, cutting line around their own property with their own equipment because the professional resources are committed somewhere else. That is not a heroic detail. It is a symptom. When landowners are cutting their own fire line in a state with nearly 1.8 million acres burned, it is because the queue I described in the last section has been empty for a while. It is also a genuinely dangerous thing to be doing. A rancher on a dozer in cured grass has no incident command, no lookouts posted, no communications linked to anybody watching the weather, and no escape route planned by someone whose only job is planning escape routes. The professional wildland fire system builds all of that around every crew it deploys precisely because the alternative kills people. When private landowners are doing the work anyway, they are absorbing a risk that the system exists to manage, and they are doing it because the alternative is watching everything they have built burn while nobody comes. And there is an economic layer under that which is easy to miss. Cattle cannot be evacuated the way a family can. Rangeland that burns is gone as forage for that season, and often the next. Fences burn, and a burned fence means livestock scattered across a landscape that is still on fire. For a ranch operation, a fire is not a property loss event that insurance sorts out. It is the removal of the productive asset itself. There is a phrase in that Oregon figure that deserves unpacking, because it does a lot of quiet work. On pace to break its modern wildfire record. The word modern is doing the heavy lifting. Reliable, systematic acreage records for the western states go back roughly a century, which means every record we talk about in these events is a record within a period that also happens to be the period of aggressive fire suppression. The landscape before that burned enormously, routinely, at low intensity, and nobody was counting. So the record is real, and it matters, but it is not a statement that this has never happened. It is a statement that this has not happened since we started writing it down, and started stopping every fire we could reach, which is precisely the arrangement that built the fuel loads now burning. The Northwest fire season, historically, peaks in August and continues until autumn. Rain arrives to shut it down. Everything I have described in this video, Spokane, the 5 lightning fires in northern Washington, Oregon's record pace, happened in the first days of August or in the last 2 weeks of July. Which means that when Dave Up the Grove said, "This year has already been one of our busiest wildfire years on record, and we just started August," he was not being dramatic. He was pointing out that the entire season to date had happened before the season's usual worst part had begun, and if you follow that fuel bed north across the border, the picture does not improve. It gets worse. Part 12. Across the Line. The forests and grasslands of the interior northwest do not stop at the 49th parallel, and neither did this. If you drive north out of the Okanagan country in Washington and cross into the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia, same valley, same river system, different national spelling, nothing about the landscape changes. Same dry interior plateau, same open ponderosa and Douglas fir, same grass on the south-facing slopes, same lakes cut into the bottom of the valleys, same orchards and vineyards on the benches above them. The border is a legal line drawn across one continuous ecosystem, and fire has never had any reason to notice it. On July 31st, the same day the Weather Service issued Washington's first ever particularly dangerous situation alert, a fire was discovered on the west shore of Okanagan Lake in British Columbia. It was named the Bradley Creek Fire. Over the weekend, it more than doubled in size, reaching roughly 26 square kilometers. It was driven by winds reported at up to 115 kilometers an hour. That is roughly 70 miles an hour, well above anything Spokane experienced. And it did to lakefront properties on Okanagan Lake exactly what the Old Trails fire did to Indian Trail. There is something almost cruelly counterintuitive about that. If you own a house on a lake, you have spent your entire ownership of that property assuming the one disaster you were insulated against was fire. there is water 30 meters from your door, and the fire came down the slope behind you in a 70-mile-an-hour wind, throwing embers ahead of itself, and the water made no difference at all, for exactly the same reason the Spokane River made no difference. A lake stops a flame front. It does not stop a shower of burning material falling out of the sky onto the roof of a house that is on the wrong side of it. Evacuation orders went out Saturday afternoon for the main reserve of the Okanagan Indian Band, for the township of Spalumchin, and for the Splatsin First Nation. Communities at the northern end of Okanagan Lake emptied out as the orders spread. Akbal Mund, the acting mayor of Vernon, said on Sunday that the winds had calmed and that about 250 evacuees had registered at the city's emergency centre for food and water. The Okanagan has seen this before, and recently. Fires in that valley have crossed the lake in previous years, driven by exactly the same mechanism, a plume strong enough to loft embers across open water onto the far shore. The people who live there know it can happen. That knowledge did not save the lakefront homes that burned this weekend, and I think there is something worth sitting with in that. Local knowledge of a hazard is not the same thing as protection from it, any more than a perfect forecast was in Spokane. British Columbia runs a 2-stage system, rather than Washington's 3. An evacuation alert means be ready to leave on short notice. An evacuation order means go, now, and it carries legal force. Communities at the north end of Okanagan Lake went from one to the other over the course of a Saturday afternoon, and that is only one fire. Roughly 20 kilometres southwest of the village of Clinton, British Columbia, the Pear Lake Fire, part of the Big Bar complex, was burning at approximately 1,039 square kilometres. That is the largest active wildfire in the province, and to put it in terms we have been using all video, it is over 250,000 acres, roughly 33 times the size of the entire Spokane complex. Across British Columbia over the same weekend, more than 5,000 people were evacuated in a 24-hour period. 31 new wildfires were reported in that same 24 hours. Storm-related damage knocked out power to more than 23,000 customers in the Okanagan and Kootenay regions. 31 new starts in a day. That is the number that tells you the province is in the same fuel state as Washington and Oregon, and it tells you something else, which is that the resource queue I described earlier does not stop at the border either. North America runs a shared wildland fire mobilization system. Crews, aircraft, and overhead teams move across the Canada-United States line in both directions every summer under long-standing agreements, and in most years that arrangement is what makes a bad season survivable. Canada sends people south when the American West is burning, and the United States sends people north when the boreal forest is. That works because the two systems rarely peak at the same moment. When they do, there is nobody to call, which is why Washington was reaching to Alaska, to Florida, and to Australia in the same week that British Columbia was evacuating 5,000 people and reporting 31 new starts in a day. So here is the full picture on the weekend of August 1st and 2nd, 2026. Washington. Roughly 425,000 acres burned year to date. 12 large fires, 4,000 personnel drawn from a dozen states and from Australia, and the second largest city in the state losing 640 structures in a night. Oregon, nearly 1.8 million acres, on a modern record pace, off a 14% snowpack. British Columbia, 5,000 evacuated in a day, 31 new starts in a day, and a single fire larger than 1,000 square kilometres. 3 jurisdictions, 2 countries, 1 continuous fuel bed, running from the Great Basin north into the British Columbia interior, sharing 1 drought regime and 1 weather pattern, and failing in 3 places at once on the same weekend. And the storm damage in the Okanagan and the Kootenays is its own small piece of evidence, because it points at the mechanism. 23,000 customers lost power to storms in the same window. That is a region being worked over by the same unstable, wind-producing frontal activity that drove the fires south of the border, the kind of pattern that delivers wind and lightning without delivering meaningful rain. It is the worst combination available, ignition sources and acceleration, arriving together over ground that has nothing left to give up. There is one more consequence of that continuity that is worth stating, because it is the part most people will actually experience. Smoke from a fuel bed this size does not stay where the fire is. It has already crossed most of the United States once this season, reaching the mid-Atlantic and the southeast from Pacific Northwest fires in late July. Western Washington, the wet green side of the state, the side that has had very few large fires and very little smoke so far, has mostly been spared by wind direction rather than by luck of geography, and the state's own deputy climatologist has said plainly that she expects that to change at some point this summer. The mechanism is specific. Northwest heat waves generate strong downslope winds off the Cascades toward the Puget Sound lowlands, and those winds carry whatever is burning east of the mountains straight into the population centers west of them. So if you live in Seattle or Tacoma or Olympia, and you have been watching this from a comfortable distance, the distance is a function of the current wind, and the current wind is not a permanent arrangement. That is what I mean when I say this is worse than you think. Not because the Spokane fire is bigger than it has been reported. It is not, and the reporting has been careful. But because the Spokane fire is being covered as a Spokane story, and it is not one. It is the most visible symptom of something happening across an entire region, and the reason it is the most visible symptom is not that it is the biggest fire. It is that it is the one that reached a city. Now. If everything I have described is a regional condition rather than a local accident, then it should have happened before, and in the same county 3 years ago, it did. Part 13. 3 years, 3 fires. On August 18th, 2023, 2 fires started north and west of Spokane on the same day. The Grey Fire began near Medical Lake at about 12:27 in the afternoon. It burned more than 10,000 acres and destroyed more than 185 structures. The Oregon Road Fire burned more than 11,000 acres and destroyed more than 380 structures. Combined, those 2 fires destroyed 710 structures, including 366 homes, and killed 2 people. Bill Slauson, Washington's chief deputy fire marshal, said afterward that he believed it was fair to say the Grey and Oregon Road fires were collectively the most destructive set of fires the state had experienced. That was 3 years ago, in the same county. 2 fires, same day, same mechanism, wind, cured fuel, a wildland-urban interface. And when it was over, Spokane County did what regions do after a disaster of that scale. It counted, it rebuilt, it studied, and it got on with things. Then, in mid-June of this year, the Upriver Fire burned just outside Spokane city limits. At least 15 homes were destroyed or heavily damaged. 1 person was reported missing by their family. It produced Washington's first wildfire fatality of 2026. That was 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks before a fire crossed the Spokane River and took 640 structures out of the northwest side of the city. 3 destructive fires. 3 years, 1 county. I do not think that is a coincidence, and I do not think it is bad luck either. I think it is a place telling you what its actual risk profile is, repeatedly, in the only language it has. Which brings me to the argument that is running through comment sections and community meetings across the region right now, and which I want to engage with honestly rather than wave away, because it is the most substantive of the alternative explanations for this event, and because the version of it that is correct and the version of it that is wrong are sitting very close together. The claim is about forest management, specifically about replanting. The observation people make is direct and visual. Drive through areas of the interior northwest that burned in previous years and look at what has been put back. Row after row of a single conifer species, planted close together, even aged all the same height, all growing at the same rate. Fast-growing species chosen because they produce merchantable timber quickly, and which draw a great deal of water out of the ground rather than holding it there. Very few deciduous trees, the broadleaf species that hold more moisture in their tissue, that drop leaves rather than resinous needles, and that historically acted as natural breaks within a mixed stand. People make this observation around Clinton, British Columbia. They make it in Washington, and the conclusion they draw is, you burned, you replanted the exact structure that burned, and now it is burning again. Of course it is. Here is where that argument is genuinely right, and it is not a small amount. The underlying forestry is mainstream, not fringe. Dense, even aged single-species plantations do carry higher crown fire risk than mixed-species stands with variable spacing. Continuous canopy allows crown fire to propagate. Uniform age means uniform structure means no natural breaks, and on top of that, a century of fire suppression east of the Cascades has left the unmanaged stands overloaded too, with fuel accumulated across decades that the historical fire regime would have burned off repeatedly. The indigenous cultural burning point is also correct and is not a romantic footnote. Peoples across the interior northwest maintained these landscapes with deliberate, frequent, low-intensity fire over very long periods, burning to promote food plants, to maintain forage and travel corridors, and to keep the understory open. The stand structures early European observers described and admired were not wild. They were managed by fire on purpose for a very long time. Agencies are now formally revisiting that practice rather than dismissing it, and the reason is that it worked. So on the general question, has the way we handle these forests made them more likely to burn catastrophically? The answer is yes, and the science says yes, and it is not a controversial position among people who study fire. Now here is where the argument overreaches, specifically in this case, and I think the distinction matters enormously. The Old Trails fire did not start in a plantation. It started in brush and grass on the open West Plains, terrain that has very little timber on it at all. It did not become a historic event by crowning through dense replanted conifer. It became a historic event by running through cured grass in a 45-mile-an-hour wind, throwing embers across a river and reaching a residential subdivision on a bluff. Once it was in that subdivision, the fuel that carried it was houses. Forest structure is a real and serious driver of the enormous timber fires in the northern half of the state. Kaiser Canyon, Modrite, Little Giant. Those are legitimate places to make that argument, and it should be made there. But if we file Spokane under bad forest management, we let the things that actually failed here go unexamined. And there is a specific list. A fourth consecutive drought year and a 52% snowpack, which is a water problem, not a forestry problem. Record low fuel moisture and fine fuels that no replanting policy affects. Neighborhoods built to the edge of open, cured grassland with no defensible transition. A fire station on 5 Mile Prairie that residents requested for years, on land the city had already bought, that was never funded because it was not a priority. And a suppression system that was already committed to 10 other large fires when this one started. Those are the failure points. Some of them are fixable and some of them are not, but none of them are addressed by planting a different tree. I am not saying the replanting critique is wrong. I am saying it is the right argument about a different fire, and that using it here is a way of feeling like we have explained something when we have not. Which leaves the other two theories that always fill the space where a cause determination has not arrived yet. The first is arson. And I want to be fair to it, because there is a real fact underneath it rather than nothing at all. 5 of the state's biggest fires this season were lightning-caused, and this one has not been attributed to lightning. That is genuinely notable, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than dismissed. What the evidence actually supports is more mundane and, in its own way, more unsettling. Nationally, human-caused ignitions are the overwhelming majority of wildfire starts, and they are almost never arson. The dominant categories are equipment use, vehicles, debris burning, and power infrastructure. And remember what the meteorologist said before any of this happened, that mowing a lawn could throw the spark, that driving with chains dragging on the pavement could throw the spark. A fire beginning around midday, right next to a road, in cured grass, on the one day Washington had ever issued a particularly dangerous situation alert, is entirely consistent with an ignition so ordinary that it happens somewhere in that county every week and produces nothing at all. Under investigation means undetermined. It does not mean concealed. The second is the power company, and here the suspicion is not unreasonable in the abstract, because utility infrastructure has caused catastrophic wildfires elsewhere in the West, and there is real litigation history behind that. But look at what Avista actually did. It warned publicly on Friday that it might preemptively shut off power. Then it de-energized roughly 40,000 customers, many of them outside the evacuation zone entirely, as a precaution. That is not the behavior of an organization being careless about ignition risk. That is an organization that read the same forecast everyone else read and concluded that its own lines were a hazard. The company's spokesman stated that the Old Trails fire did not originate on Avista infrastructure, but that parts of the system were damaged by the fire. Treat that as a claim rather than a verdict, because the investigation is open and the utility is an interested party. But do not treat the absence of a verdict as evidence of one either. And there is a third theory that attaches itself to every extreme fire event, which is that the weather itself was engineered. Its specific problem here is the same thing that makes this whole event so unsettling in the first place. The meteorology was forecast in advance, publicly, by name, with an alert level Washington had never used, and the state acted on that forecast before the first ignition existed. A dry cold front producing 45-mile-an-hour gusts over single-digit humidity in a fourth consecutive drought year is a well-understood pattern. The fact that the forecast was right days ahead of time is the strongest available argument that there was nothing exotic in it. So if it is not the replanting, and it is not arson, and it is not the power company, then what is left is the uncomfortable answer, which is the one that has been sitting underneath this entire video. Part 14. The Gap. Let me go back to where we started because the whole thing collapses into one comparison. The National Weather Service issued a warning level it had never used in the history of Washington state. The governor declared a statewide emergency and a burn ban before a single one of these fires existed. 110 National Guard members were already on fire lines, the first activation since 2021. The fire department went from 69 firefighters to about 100. The power company preemptively cut electricity to 40,000 customers. The state's Wildland Fire Division manager said out loud, in advance, that the winds would create explosive fire growth rarely seen in Washington. 4,000 personnel from more than a dozen states and from Australia were already in the field. The legislature had doubled the firefighting budget to $120 million, and a grass fire started at noon, and by dawn 640 buildings were gone. There are only two explanations for that gap, and which one is true determines everything about what happens next. The first explanation is capability. Under this reading, the problem is that there were not enough engines, not enough crews, not enough aircraft, not enough people. 10 large fires were already burning. 4,000 personnel were already committed. Stevens County said houses burned because resources ran short. If that is the whole story, then the fix is more of everything. Bigger budgets, deeper mutual aid, more aircraft, more trained crews, and it is expensive, but it is tractable. The problem with the capability explanation is that Washington already tried it. The state doubled its firefighting appropriation for this year. $120 million, twice the previous budget. It brought in engines barged from Alaska and crews from Florida, and firefighters from Australia. And on the 1st of August, it watched a fire it had forecast perfectly take a piece of its second largest city, and it could not stop it. And by the honest testimony of the assistant fire chief on the scene, no fire department in the country could have. Which leaves the second explanation: exposure. Under this reading, the number of engines was never the binding constraint. The binding constraint is the condition of the landscape and the position of the people on it. 4 consecutive drought years, a snowpack at half of normal, fuel moisture at record lows in fuels that respond within hours, neighborhoods built to the edge of cured grassland, on bluffs, with single-access roads, in a region where the historical fire regime has been suppressed for a century, and a forecast for a super El Niño that would deliver a warm, low-snow winter, meaning next spring starts from a fuel state at least as bad as this one. If the exposure explanation is right, then more engines do not fix it. Not because firefighting does not matter, it obviously does, and those crews saved an enormous number of houses in Indian Trail and 5 Mile Prairie that nobody will ever count. But because a suppression system, however well funded, is a response to ignition, and the exposure explanation says the problem is that ignitions now land in a landscape where the ordinary outcome is catastrophic, and that is the version where the Spokane complex is not an outlier at all. It is a preview. There is a hard edge to the exposure argument that nobody enjoys saying out loud, and it is about where the houses are. The Old Trails fire was not remarkable when it was burning Riverside State Park. It became one of the worst disasters in the history of a region at the moment it reached the bluffs where people live. The variable that turned 7,000 acres into 640 destroyed structures was not the fire's size or its speed. It was the density and the arrangement of what was standing in its way. The measures that address that are unglamorous, and they are all local. Defensible space around a house, cleared vegetation, no woodpile against the wall, no dry needles in the gutter, screened attic vents that embers cannot enter, non-combustible roofing, second-axis roads out of hillside subdivisions so that the entire neighborhood is not funneled onto a single gridlocked street. And, yes, a fire station on 5 Mile Prairie, on land the city already owned, that residents asked for repeatedly and were told was not a priority. None of that is exciting. None of it makes for a news conference. All of it is cheaper than what Spokane just lost. And there is a timing problem underneath all of it, which is the part I keep coming back to. The forecast for this coming winter is a strengthening El Niño heading toward the super category, which in the Pacific Northwest historically means warm and low on snow. If that verifies, the snowpack does not recover, the soil moisture does not recover, and the 5th consecutive drought year begins from a starting point at least as poor as the 4th one, which is the one that produced everything I have just described. Nobody involved in this has been coy about which way they lean, and I think that is worth noticing. These are not activists. These are the people who hold the operational responsibility. Dave Upthegrove, the Commissioner of Public Lands, standing next to the Governor while the city burned. This is an extraordinary fire season. This is not normal. This is unusual. And a day earlier, this year has already been one of our busiest wildfire years on record, and we just started August. Thomas Kyle Millward at the Department of Natural Resources on why this season is different. Large fires in the last week of July are not unusual, but it's the number that we've seen already that is the outlier. Russ Lane, the Wildland Fire Division manager, one day before, high winds will create explosive fire growth that is rarely seen in Washington state. Major General Gent Welsh, 38 years in uniform on the conditions being the worst of his career. When the sun sets and the sun rises, we're going to be in shock. Assistant Chief Lance Dahl on the limits of his profession. There is not a fire department in the US that can handle a wind-driven event this size. Every one of them was right. That is what makes this a mystery rather than a surprise, and there are 3 specific things still hanging, which I will be watching and which I would encourage you to watch too. The first is the final count. As I record this, no deaths have been confirmed, and officials have simultaneously said that large portions of the burn area have not been searched, and that the potential for lives to be lost remains. Both of those are true at once. The structure figure of roughly 640 to 700 is preliminary, from teams who could not reach every neighborhood, and the direction it moves will determine whether this formally becomes the most destructive wildfire event in the history of Washington state, a record currently held by 2 fires in the same county 3 years ago. The second is the cause. 5 of Washington's largest fires this season were started by lightning. This one was not identified as lightning. The investigation into what ignited the Old Trails fire is open, and the answer, equipment, a vehicle, a power line, a debris burn, something else entirely, is the single fact that decides whether this event gets read as misfortune or as something that should have been prevented. That answer will not arrive for weeks, and by then most of the coverage will have moved on. And the third is the wind. Because the pause that Spokane is currently sitting in was not won. It was granted. Cooler air and lighter northerly winds arrived on Sunday and stopped the forward progress of 2 of the 3 fires, and that had nothing to do with suppression. The complex is still at 0% containment. Every foot of that perimeter is still capable of moving. The Northwest fire season historically peaks in August and runs until autumn. Rain finally puts it out, and the rain is not close. And I want to say one more thing about the people in this, because it is easy for a video like this to turn into a systems analysis and lose them. 640 structures is a number. What it actually is Daryl and Nancy Wagner standing in a parking lot with their dog after 31 years in the same house, not knowing whether it is still there. It is Monica Opfer with her dog, and her medication saying she does not know where she's going to go. It is Bobby Atwood carrying a dog with burned paws away from a house on West Euclid Road, while several of her other animals are still missing. It is a 19-year-old at a convention centre at 8:30 at night looking for a changing table for a 6-month-old. And it is also, on the other side, roughly 100 firefighters working a fire that their own assistant chief has said no department in the country could have handled, house by house, all night, in the dark, with the water pressure failing. Whatever the final number turns out to be, there is another number that will never be published. The count of houses that are still standing this morning because somebody stood in front of them. So the question I am left with, standing at the end of the worst weekend in Spokane's modern history, is not what started this fire. It is this. A state saw a fire coming with more precision than it has ever seen a fire coming, and did everything it knew how to do a day in advance, and lost 640 buildings anyway. If that is what happens when the warning is perfect, what exactly are we planning to do differently the next time the wind comes back before crews have secured a single foot of that line?